All right, in this video we're going to talk about the absolutism and how it worked out in France. Tomorrow you guys are going to see a really great example of absolutist architecture, and you're going to look at the palace at Versailles, which was Louis XIV's grand palace that he built. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to talk a little bit about absolutism and how it happened in France. So first of all, the roots in France really lay with a family called the Bourbons. The Bourbons came to power in France because of Henry IV. Henry IV, if you guys will remember, was the guy that became king in France during the era of the Reformation. And the reason he became king was because no one was there, and he was the next in line. The problem with Henry IV was that Henry IV was raised Protestant. And this is not something we talked about, but in order to be king of France, you actually had to be Catholic. And so Henry said, all right, fine, I'll become a Catholic. The Paris, he said, Paris is well worth the mass. So Henry became Catholic basically just so he could become king of France. Now, if you'll remember, he also issued the Edict of Nantes, which eliminated religious persecution and allowed a certain amount of religious freedom for the Huguenots. But a lot of people didn't like that. And so what happened as a result of that is he was eventually assassinated. Okay? And so he was assassinated, and during this time period, during the 1400s, late 1500s, during the 1500s rather, Richelieu rules for him and also rules for his son, whose name is Louis XIII. Okay? Richelieu obviously is a cardinal that we talked about. And so what Richelieu does is he really consolidates power, and that means brings in all this power for the throne of France. Okay, he starts bringing it in. Yesterday, if you'll remember, I said that there was a lot of conflict between the nobility and the king itself, and the monarchy itself. Well, Richelieu really adds to this. He serves as what's called, not really the regent, but the head of government, and really begins to consolidate power. Well, Richelieu dies before the end of the 30 Years' War, even though he does gain a lot of power for France in himself and consolidates power. And when he dies, Louis XIII takes over and rules, and then another guy, Louis XIII, dies shortly. Another cardinal named Mazarin, you don't really need to know his name, Mazarin takes over. Okay? Well, when Mazarin takes over is because Louis XIII's wife has a kid named Louis, who will become Louis XIV, and he is called the Dauphin, the little boy prince. Okay, I mentioned in the earlier video that he was considered a gift from God because Louis XIII and his wife had been married for 25 years, had numerous attempts at children, and didn't actually have one. And so this little boy becomes the heir to the throne, but he can't rule yet because he's not old enough according to French law. And so who rules for him is his mother. His mother rules and begins to consolidate power for him. Well, the reason this is important is because when Louis XIV is a child, there's something called the Fronde. It's a revolt of the peasants and the nobility against the king. And that's really important because it sets up kind of a paranoia against the nobility. He is afraid of the nobility. And so when he officially becomes king in 1643 and rules, for all intents and purposes, on his own, all by himself until 1715, he really says, you know what, I don't like people, I'm distrustful of the nobility, so I'm going to rule and govern everything myself, and we'll get more into that in just a second. So Louis XIV is known as the Sun King. I mentioned in the earlier video that he was actually seen as a gift from God to his parents, and so that attitude sort of carries on into his later years. And as the Sun King, he basically says, all of France radiates from me, all power. I am the light of France. He even goes so far as to say later, le state est moi, or c'est moi. That basically means I am the state. I am the government. The government is within me. And so in order to illustrate this, he sets up his power in order to make everybody know just how powerful he is. He sets up this palace at Versailles. This palace at Versailles, which we'll see tomorrow, is the largest, most ornate building in the world. It is the grandest palace of all palaces. Think of the most obnoxious house you can think of, the biggest, baddest, prettiest, most overdone house. Well, that was Versailles. And one of the things that he did was he kept all of the nobility there pretty much year-round so that he could keep an eye on them and he could make sure they knew exactly who was in power. And so the palace at Versailles was his image, was his physical place of power. Another important thing about Louis XIV is he is a huge mercantilist. He had his chief finance minister. Remember, I said they set up bureaucracies in absolutism. His chief finance minister, who ran the bureaucracy of finance, was a guy named Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And Colbert was the father of mercantilism in France. Again, gathering wealth, gathering bullion. States, colonies are used only for your power. You want to export more than you import. Louis begins to practice mercantilism so that he can gain lots of money, and it works out pretty well for them. And so that's early in his career, early in his reign, mercantilist power exudes from France. And so they gain a lot of wealth, a lot of money through the exploration of colonies. They gain a lot of wealth, a lot of money through this theory of mercantilism. They don't spend a whole lot. And what they do with all that money is they launch many wars of expansion. Louis is really known for his wars of expansion. In fact, he is pretty much at a constant state of war with the rest of Europe, and with Britain too, in the New World to a certain degree. He is pretty much at a constant state of war during the last 15, 20, 30 years of his reign. So he is at war quite a bit. It even gets so much, and he goes to so many wars that he melts down the palace silver and metal so that they can have wealth to buy and pay for the army, and so that they can also have weapons. And so that is absolutism as France. We see Louis XIV as the Sun King. I'll underline it here. All power exudes from him. His palace of residence is Versailles. He says, hey, I have this big, great house. Everybody has to stay here to see how big and powerful I actually am. And he also uses mercantilism to consolidate and gain more bullion, more wealth for the nation of France, for himself. And he also launches several wars of expansion to gain more power for not only himself but more land, because land does equal